I like to joke. I moved to Los Angeles and became an influencer, and that scares the crap out of me. But on the other side, I'm also like a professional athlete, and the social media side is part of it. For me, I consider myself to be super fortunate in that the social media side, I'm pretty open with it. It's not super curated. I don't have to do filters. I'm like pretty much just like say what's in my head and post, and I'm lucky that that has been kind of successful. With that, I definitely do treat it like a job. In that I consider myself pretty good with answering messages and engaging with people on the Instagram and things like that. Just because I do think like with a social media following, you are in a position of power to either inspire others or help others with their questions and things like that. So for me, it's almost like answering emails. You're like, okay, we're going to go through the DMs. I'm going to put my Normatech legs on and I'm going to spend the next hour like answering messages. And so it is an interesting side of the job that I never really would have expected, I don't know, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. And so it's been interesting to kind of mediate that and also balance I'm a pretty social person, but for me, sometimes it's not fulfilling to spend hours interacting with strangers, basically. So you have to also remember that even though I've talked to, I don't know, hundreds of people that day, that I didn't actually like have any real social interaction because I rode my bike by myself and then I answered, people on Instagram. And for me, then I have to find something else fulfilling to kind of fill the actual social void, which is an interesting thing as well.
How do you fill that social void?
I think it's a balance. It's friends, it's podcasts, it's calling my family. I'm far away from my family. They're in San Francisco, Bay Area mostly. So FaceTimes with my sisters and her kids. And then I have to try not to just be like, okay, when does my boyfriend come home? Like play with me, hang out with me. Cause like he's been at work all day at a regular job and had social interaction. So you definitely have to figure out like how to see friends and if you can get a friend to go on a ride or do a training ride with you as well, that helps.
And so you're in LA, right?
Hmm.
Which are you on the west side or the east side?
I'm on the west side, so I live in Santa Monica.
Okay, so you're in Santa Monica, right? And the riding, of course, is excellent there, as everyone knows. You have all the canyons, you have the PCH, which also can be like that's can be pretty fraught.
Yeah.
And then you have world class group rides like the Simi ride, the Montrose ride, the Rose Bowl, all those. I lived in LA for like
Yeah,
14
yeah.
years.
It's like these are local
Um,
rides.
yeah, totally. But so do you tend to stick to the west side when you're doing your riding?
I do. It's a funny kind of conundrum where when your backyard is, hundreds of, different options of climbs and things like that. Like you could
Right.
go down to PV and do that climb, or I could go east and do the big climbs in the mountains over there. But the idea of either riding junk miles or getting in a car to go train, I'm
Yeah.
kind of like, it's the like why fix if it's not broken. But the few times I have gone to the east side for rides, like those are real mountains over there. Like those are bigger than what we have on the west side. And so it is good to switch it up. But with that, like I know it less well. You have to plan like where's your water, like how hot is it gonna be, how cold is it gonna be? Are you gonna like broil or are you gonna get snowed on? Like the weather extremes when you get up to like 8,000 to 9,000 feet, like those are different than when you're just going from like sea level to 3,000 feet over and over again.
Yeah. And when you go that high, when you get up into like the Mount Wilson territory, there's always the danger that like someone on PCP is on in a car chase going down the Angeles Crest Highway or something. I mean, I bring that up because I've been up there before when that's happened.
It's real.
Yeah,
Like it's an interesting. I of course am very lucky to be able to ride a lot of my rides during the week in the middle of the day when
sure.
there's not many things. And it was funny when I was here and I was in business school, I'd post photos on Instagram and people are like, where are you? And you're like, I'm not that far away from our school, but you would never go here unless you have a fancy Porsche or you have a bike. Like you just
Right.
wouldn't. And so it's an interesting, like the only people that you see out there are either other cyclists or like fancy cars, which is very funny.
And ironically, I was reflecting on this today as I was preparing for this interview, and I was thinking about some of the biggest talents in professional cycling who are women um, have kind of similar past years where they're very high achieving in finance or in tech or, venture capital, which of course is like more on the finance side. And then they leave that career and then they become a professional athlete at an age that's like relatively late to become a professional athlete, yet they make
Yeah,
that transition. And it's such an amazing thing, but there are a couple of examples of that, right? Like I've had Kristen Faulkner on the podcast who also got started later. I
yeah.
can think of a few others, but it's such a massive shift and it's taking, I'm curious for you, did that feel like a big risk when you walked away from what you were doing after having completed your MBA to pursue becoming a professional athlete?
For sure. Absolutely. Like it's an interesting I kind of upended my life in New York to move to Los Angeles to go to business school. And then from there, the path was supposed to be fintech. It was, or even at the time, like I just started riding bikes. I remember I applied to like an internship at Strava and I was like, maybe I'll like get to work in the bike industry. And then suddenly I had qualified to be a pro triathlete and I was kind of looking at the marketing side of things and saying like, okay, the athletes now that they have, like, they're great, but they all of their sponsors are within, the triathlon world or things like that. And so I was kind of saying like, if I can approach it from a different angle, if I can maybe use the business side to grow a brand and do kind of the professional athlete thing in a new way, maybe that might work. And my mentality was like, let's give myself a year. I graduated in 2019 and then the pandemic hit. And so it was kind of an interesting, like, okay, does this year count? Like, I'm not spending any money really. I'm like, I have rent and maybe some food and that's it. Like, I'm not traveling. I'm actually not burning cash as much. So maybe I have a little bit more runway. Can I use it? Can I build this into something real within the next year? So 2021 was kind of my first year and got some brands to take a chance on me, and then from there have been able to build it. But it's definitely kind of scary when you're graduating from business school and you're like, you have this track, you now have gone to an Ivy League education, you worked on Wall Street, and then you now went to one of the top business schools in the world. Like, it's much easier to say like, I'm gonna have a steady paycheck, I'm gonna go work for a fintech, I'm gonna work at a desk, and I'm gonna ride bikes on the weekend and have the money to buy everything that I need and be happy in that way. And for me, it's always an interesting balance of like, do you do the job that pays you the money to be able to go on the trips and have all the hobbies that you want, or do you do the job that's truly a passion and probably is a pay cut from what you would be doing at a desk? So that for me was the balance. And now I consider myself to be super fortunate in that I've been able to build a brand and build partnerships in order to have a sustainable lifestyle where I'm riding my bike for a living, which is kind of absurd to think about. But I'm pretty proud of that. And I do know like there's always a shelf life on being an athlete. And so with that, like you said, I'm a little bit older. And I actually just did an interview with Shimano, which was titled like, it's never too late. Which as a, 27-year-old, if that's the first time you've ever clipped into a bike, like, is it too late to be a professional athlete? As a soccer player, absolutely yes. As an endurance athlete, no. And so I think it's fun to kind of prove that and go into it and see what I can do here with the knowledge of like, at some point I will go back to working at a desk or doing something else that's not competing at the top level of the sport.
What did you believe was the maximum thing that would be possible for you to achieve when you did make that decision to become a full-time professional athlete?
That's a really good question. Um, I think my goal originally was line up at the biggest races in the country and see what I could do. For me, my first gravel race was Unbound, and it was I went into it kind of as this like, no one really knows who I am, but she's wearing bright orange, and who is this person? And I ended up finishing 8th, and from there I was kind of like, maybe I can do this. And I think it's been really interesting to go from there. And at the time I didn't have a coach. I had never done a race. I finished, 8th in the top biggest race in the world. And then now I'm sitting here 2 years later and I've gotten faster and I know the course is better and I am finishing consistently further down the rankings, which is an interesting way. Like, the sport has gotten so competitive in the last 2 years that it's interesting to say, like, I am really fortunate in the way that I timed it. If I had joined even in 2022 or this year, like, you finish I don't know, 12th and 15th, and these are your results, I probably say this is really awesome and I'm fast, but it's not for me. And so I have had to balance being like, okay, there's suddenly more women and more competition than there ever has been. Where is my place in this sport? And can I still balance wanting to win all these races and then also coming to the like, okay, in a bike race, there's 4,000 people and one man and one woman is going to win. So it's not like a soccer game. In a soccer game, half the people on the field are going to win. And so for me, like balancing the expectations of I want to train as hard as I possibly can and be the best I can possibly be with also maybe not like maybe a top 20 is good.
Right. And to have that feeling of being someone who is all in, you're fully committed, you're training harder and smarter than you ever have before in your entire life. And what you just shared is the same thing that I've heard from a number of professional athletes who are competing in mixed surface or gravel racing, which is, hey, you know what? I averaged 20, 30 watts higher in this race than I did last year. And I am 10 or 15 places
It's
down in the
crazy.
rankings,
You're
right?
like, what am I doing wrong? How is everyone so much faster? Like, it's
Right.
a funny, I think Crusher and the Tusher is an interesting, it's a relatively smaller race within the Lifetime Grand Prix, but I was listening to Payson's podcast and he was like, if the top 15 men that finished this year would have won the race every single year prior to this year and last year. So you're like, that kind of speaks to the caliber of both female and male side of like, it's just like like record breaking across the board, and how
Right.
as kind of a top performing athlete do you wrap your head around like everyone's faster than they have ever been and so are you, but you're still not getting the results that maybe you're training for.
Does that shift for you how you approach your training and your mindset going into the events?
Yeah, yes. um, as an incredibly competitive person, I really, really don't like the feeling of I'm showing up to just complete this, just survive this race. And but then on the other side, I have the way that I have built my brand. None of my sponsors are or partners are with me because I am gonna win necessarily. Like, I mean, hopefully they would be happy for me if I won, but all of them care about who I am as a person and the story that I've told, and kind of the inspiring other people to get into the sport and hopefully make it more inclusive. And that's something that is really, really important to me. And I think I have to take a deep breath before these races and say, like, I really, really do want to win. But on the other side, like, if someone is at that race because they saw me do something hard and they were like, I'm going to train for this race and I'm going to show up and I'm going to do it, like that for me is longer lasting than a good finishing time. And so you have to take a step back and say, try your absolute best and rip some people's legs off. And I'm never going to give that side up. But also with that, like there is a bigger picture. And I think it's pretty funny. Like I'll be out on the course and again, Crusher and the Tusher was not a great race for me. But the amount of people that within the race were like, let's go, Wiz, how you doing? And I'm like, not good, not good. But like just the interactions, as I mentioned, like the social side for me, you say, those strangers that I'm interacting with on Instagram, those are real people on the other side. And a lot of those people come to the races and then I get to meet them in person. And that for me is super fulfilling. Um, and so being able to like meet someone, be like, hey, it's like, you're doing great. I'm doing my best time. Like, can we ride together? You're like, absolutely. That part, like the kind of team aspect of it within an individual sport is really, really important. And I think the more that we can kind of like come together as a gravel community or a cycling community, is really important because in the end of the day, like we're all doing something that's super, super hard. And it doesn't matter if you're a pro or if it's your first time ever, like we're all going out there to do the best that we possibly can. And that is more important, I think, than the result.
Whether it's Crusher and the Tusher or some of the other events, in the middle of all of that, and I can tell, like you're a super optimistic person, as you noted. You're highly competitive, and I mean, just look at what you've done in a very short period of time. It's pretty incredible
Thanks.
and remarkable. And is there space in that? Do you feel disappointment or do you feel anything that starts to drag you down a little bit?
1,000%. Like
Yeah.
doubts. It's the like, should I just be an influencer? Like it'd be way easier. I could just like ride my bike around and post selfies and why am I flogging myself with these threshold intervals and things like that? I think those thoughts definitely creep into my mind. Like you fail a workout and you're like, why? Like, why am I doing this? And I think at the end of the day, like I went into this saying like this has a shelf life and I'm not going to do it for very long. So take advantage of the fact that your body will do this and will respond to the hard work that you put in, and remind yourself that like me against myself, I am getting faster. I'm getting better with nutrition. I'm still learning, like I'm still relatively new in this sport, or at least I feel new. And so what are the lessons that I'm learning and how do I then share those with others so they don't have to learn it themselves. But definitely like the doubts creep in for sure. I think like a lot of people, myself maybe included, will go through their career without having ever won anything. And then you start to say, like, do I just race smaller races? Like, is it really like I just need to go get a win? I could do that. You could go race something smaller and just be like, I needed to stand on that top step. But for me, that wasn't the goal, was to be like the best I can possibly be against the best, and not the best I can be against like the local, other few people that showed up to that race.
When you think about when you have been at your personal best in a competitive environment with professional cycling, what race or moment do you
Ooh.
consider to have been the highest expression of who you are as an athlete?
It's an interest. So I think BWR California is my favorite race. It's kind of the closest to what mimics what I do in my training. It's so hard and has road and it has mountain bikes, but you're on a road bike with monster truck tires, or the biggest tires you can fit on your road bike. And I always do relatively well at those races. I finished fourth my first year I ever did it, and then sixth last year when I slashed my elbow open because someone hit me from behind. And that was honestly like, as painful as that was one of the like biggest challenges to push your body through this. And maybe you should probably stop because you're still dripping blood 6 hours later into a race. And I ended up having to go get 10 staples in my elbow, and the scar will be with me forever. But again, it's funny to say, like, I still finished sixth. I flatted in that race and I ripped my elbow open and was actively losing blood, and I still was able to like push through one of the hardest races of the year. And that for me, like, it's weird to say, but I'm really proud of that. I think when the ER doctor told me that if I was a man, I would have passed out or died before the finish line, I was like, let's go. That's all I needed. um, and then this year, BWR, I was in second place when I slashed my sidewall of my tire. And then did the whole like try and plug it, doesn't plug, put a tube in, flat that tube, put another tube in, blah, blah, blah. And I still finished fourth. You were like, okay, you yo-yo for 20 minutes of doing flat stuff. And I've been the girl that's back further, where you're like, how did that person finish in front of me? She had like 7,000 flats and like she still beat me. And so for that moment, I was like, wait a second, I got to be that person that truly felt so good that other girls behind me like rode their hardest the whole time with no mechanicals, and I was still like in front of them. And I think that's an interesting dynamic of like, okay, maybe I do belong here. Like, yes, it wasn't my day, and yes, I had a mechanical, but like I can do this. And so there's little glimpses where you're like, wait a second, maybe I am. Like, BWR is always interesting because it's, for me, the first big race of the year, and I normally do pretty well. And so my year starts like this, and then you go like, and you start going to these like rolling gravel races or like sheer watts a kilo climbing races, which for me, neither are great. I like to say that like the harder the conditions, the better. Make it hot, make it, dicey, make it sketchy, because I tend to flourish when it is super, super hard. So
When you when you
yeah,
were doing that torn sidewall hokey pokey at BWR, what did you feel like in the moment?
like panic, sheer panic of like, can I, I'm out of tubes. Can I walk? Like, can I run? Can I, get any old triathlon self back? And can I run in my road shoes to the next, aid station that's a mile ahead? And ran out to the mechanic. I was like, can you help me? Like, I'm pretty, in the moment, I would like to be much more like calm, cool, collected. I think when I slashed my elbow open, like a volunteer on the side, like gave me a mask because it was still 2021, and I tied the mask on, and I got to the aid station that was like 5 miles ahead, and I was like, anybody have duct tape? Like, I was still in third place at the time. I was like, we gotta do this. And so actually later in the year, the guy who ended up, like, he did a great job. He actually put gauze on it. He didn't listen to me and put duct tape on it. He came up to me, and he was at another race, and he was like, hey, it's like, I just want to say hi. How's your elbow doing? I was the guy that taped you up. And I was so thankful for him being calm in that moment. So it is an interesting, how do you, even though it's an individual like sport, if that happens to you at Unbound or somewhere where you're like truly out in the middle of nowhere, like, I'm gonna have to be more calm than I was at either issue that happened at BWR, where you're just like, okay, take a deep breath. How do you fix this? How do you put a new tire in, get your tire back on, things like that. So it's an interesting, when you prepare for these races, you prepare physically and you do all the training, but then you also, at least for me, like, I will go to my bike shop and put my tire back on and practice doing that, because if you slash a tubeless tire, it's actually really, really hard to get your tire back on if you have to put a tube in. So that, as someone that's relatively new, like, it's funny to say, but I got to practice it.
I mean, I did that this year before I did Rasputica. I got
Yeah.
out of drill, and I was about to change my tires anyway. I've actually never had to plug any of my tubeless tires ever, so I was like, I better practice
Practice.
this, right?
Totally.
Because if you're going to put in, I mean, and you're a professional athlete, so the stakes are even higher. But yeah, it is interesting if you're going to put in all the time in training, mental preparation.
Yeah.
You need to spend some time doing things like cutting holes in your tires and plugging them, which I don't know what you would do with a torn sidewall. Like, what's the pro tip there? I used to just
So
I'd put like a folded dollar bill on
yeah,
the side of a tire
dollar bill
as
is
an
really good
under.
if you don't have a dollar
Yeah.
bill. Gel wrappers are awesome. Like, shout out to the Morton gel wrapper that got me through the last 20 miles of BWR.
Yeah.
So those are pretty good. I think my favorite story, kind of along these lines, last 2 years ago doing Unbound, everyone was super scared that Cam Wurf was doing it. Like, crazy athlete,
Right.
Ineos, blah, 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 World Tour, Tour de France. Like, I think I passed him 4 times because he would flat, and then like 7 people would be around him, like fixing his flat. And I was like, it's nice for Cam Worth that people stop and help him. But like, in the World Tour, you don't have to fix your flat. Like, he was
Right.
lucky that people knew who he was and were like, yeah, let me help you. But like, on the 4th one, I was like, this is honestly like my favorite entertainment of the race. Like, go ahead, flat, go ahead, flat. Like, and so
That's
it just
hilarious.
shows, like, these races truly are, you have to be self-sufficient unless you're, in the world tour, in which case people will help you, which is nice. And again, that speaks to the gravel community, where people are like, I get to help Kim Worf. Hell yeah, I'm in. Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, that guy, he gets around, right? Ironman's,
Yeah, he's a savage.
gravel racing. Yeah. He's everywhere. Perry Roubaix. Um, when you go to start a race and you're on the starting line, what is your mentality? Is it, let's see what happens today? Is it, I'm definitely going to win the race? Like, where are you at on that continuum?
I think it goes different ways. I think I show up to a BWR California, and you're like, the goal today is to win. And I've been, at this year's race, like, I was leading the race at one point, and that was a new feeling for me. And I was like, okay, let's go. Like, I've trained for this first 10-minute climb. I know what to do. I've ridden this course a bunch. Other races, it's control what you can, and whatever you can't control, like, roll with it. I think for me, the biggest change in my training has been the beginning of these races start so fast that it used to be like you kind of rolled out for the first, 10 whatever miles until there was like a decisive factor, and then people started like making a selection. Now you start at 30 miles an hour as fast as you possibly can go it doesn't matter if it's 200-mile race, like the first 2 hours of Unbound will be the hardest 2 hours of your life. And so it doesn't matter how fit you are for hour 12 if you get dropped in the first 2 hours. And so I've switched my mentality of like the goal going into Steamboat is next weekend is stay as far forward as I can. Like that's the goal, because as soon as those group forms, it will get easier, and then the groups kind of spread. So no matter if you're pushing the same power as the group in front of you, it kind of like yo-yos, and the gaps get too big for you to close them. And so I've switched to have like little goals within races where you're like, okay, the first 2 hours is a big goal of mine. And then outside of that, like fueling well and being able to push at the finish line is really important for me. So I think like if you take a learning mentality into these races, you're like, okay, what did I do wrong last year in this race? How can I do that better specifically? And then if that results, gets you a better result, then great, amazing. That's a win.
In a race like Unbound, where, as you mentioned, the first 2 hours might be the hardest 2 hours, or feel
Yeah.
like the hardest 2 hours you've ever ridden, or looking forward to the race this weekend, do you have a script prepared or something that you tell yourself when that elastic starts to snap, or when that voice in your head says, why am I doing this?
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yes. I think the first thing is like just 30 more seconds. Like everybody's hurting 30 more. Like it's too hard for everybody in this moment. No one's coasting. Like it's hard for everybody else. It's pretty funny. I am very obvious when I'm suffering. My breathing gets really, really heavy. And I've actually done some like YouTube videos where people are like, whoa, make sure you have headphones in. Like it's very like obviously uncomfortable. So people will be like, Iz, are you okay? And you're like, clearly, no, I'm not okay, but I'm not going to fake it. I'm just going to like try and hold on to the wheel. So that's my like kind of ridiculous, the side that's very obvious. But I think the internal monologue is, I don't know, if you take the name of this podcast, like it's a lot easier to stop pedaling. It's a lot easier to give up. I think like what we put our bodies through is a privilege to be able to do it. So if you think about it that way, like there's a lot of people that would like to be there, not necessarily like in that specific group in the race, just like generally. I think if you talk about like the privilege of being able to push your body and race your bike, like that for me, I will try to never take advantage of that, or take that for granted, because I've seen it get taken away from people, whether it's injury or old age or sickness or truly tragic accidents. And so the ability to be in that moment and say like, this really, really sucks right now. But on the flip side, like people would kill to be in my position. And so maybe I can push a little bit harder, if that makes sense. And I think like that for me is really important to remember, because in the moment it really doesn't feel good, but to remember that like whether it's grief or anything like that, like that kind of suffering is really, really shitty. And then the kind that we get to electively put ourselves through, like that's awesome. In comparison, like that physical pain, I think like I went through months where it was just like, no, I'm like empty inside. I don't have energy to go really do anything besides soft pedal my bike and try not to cry. And you're like, now I get to be here with my legs are burning and my lungs are burning, and this is really truly like, I don't know, I don't even know the word for it, but it's different. And it's like something that we're really, really lucky to do.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I completely agree with you. And I think that's such a valuable perspective, and one that so many people, like including myself, like I think it's so easy to overlook whatever you have. There are people who don't have it, whoever you are, right?
Yeah.
And like the fact that like we're alive, we
Yeah.
get to have this conversation. We're embodied consciousnesses.
Yeah.
We
You're
have
alive,
legs with
you're
which we can
healthy.
go pedal bikes,
Yeah.
right?
I think
Yeah.
it's really easy to
Yeah.
think like
These are all true gifts.
you realize it, especially when you get injured. Like so take for granted, being able to run, and then I broke my back in 2019, and you're like, man, I forgot, like I never really realized what the joy to just like run after a loose ball or like hustle to class when you're like, nope, I gotta walk because I broke this bone. And the feeling of like coming back and building back into running for me, like before it was like, running hurts, like blah blah blah, and then you get something taken away, and you really value it. So I think with cycling, the goal is like, don't ever get to the point where you resent it. And it's easy to burn out and think like, this is a job and I have to go ride my bike. And I think it's really important for me to remember, like, I get to go ride my bike, and just that switch of mentality of like, I get to go train, I get to go push my body. And I think that maybe goes back to the question of like, do you ever doubt yourself when you're not winning? And it's absolutely yes. But if you try and switch your mentality to, this is a privilege that I get to go do, it's maybe a little bit more motivating in that way.
Absolutely. And you mentioned you broke your back. What happened?
So I broke the
We just kind
sacral
of, we can't,
bone.
sorry, we
Yeah, we
can't
just like
just,
threw that out there.
yeah, we can't just gloss this. Yeah, this has gotten kind of heavy, which is great. This is a good conversation, and it could, yeah. I like honestly, like so many things are coming to mind for me. Yesterday was the anniversary of the death of one of my best
Oh
friends,
my gosh.
and who he completed 18 Ironmans. He's an amazing person,
Oh my
Aaron
God.
Burby. So that's on my mind today, and just so many things recently in the news with cycling.
Yeah.
Uh, people in the gravel community, and then other people like um, just getting killed, run over by cars, which
Yeah.
is something that I personally think about every time I go out on a ride on my bike. And I tell my kids I love them. I give them
Absolutely.
a kiss, and they don't know like that I'm actually thinking about that, but it is something I think about all the time.
Yeah, I agree.
Um, but to go back to your broken back that you tried to gloss over, uh, yeah. So casually you broke your back. Like what went down?
Yeah, so I generally have learned that I have a pretty high pain tolerance. I think when I found out that I broke
That's what we're finding out today. Yeah.
the takeaway. So I was on a run, and I suddenly so I broke the sacral bone, which is kind of like the winged portion in the lower of your back. I was on a run.
Oof.
The doctor literally, like, it just started hurting. So I went to the doctor. We took X-rays. They said your bone is cracked. I was like, wow, do I have like really bad bones? And they were like, nope, like just really really tight hips. So my hips had shifted my pelvis, so it was twisted. So when I was running, it was putting like an extreme amount of pressure on that bone, enough to crack it, which is pretty crazy. I also found out when we were getting those X-rays, they were like, "When did you break your L5?" And I was like, "Ooh, I don't know." They were like, "Well, you clearly like at some point in your life you broke that bone, like what?" And it's healed now. And I remember I was like, "Oh, there was a time I was like." I don't know. I slipped. I was wearing these stupid slippers in my house, and I slipped and I landed on my back really hard on the stairs. And I was like, that was probably it. But like, I don't know. It just hurt for a long time. And so it's a funny, like, goes back to your elbow or you're like, I gotta be careful when things hurt. Like it might actually be something real.
That's wild. So gosh, I'm just thinking about how often people talk about how, like you probably have like really tight psoas muscles and like you need to do
1,000%.
mobility, but it
I was
sounds
like,
like you
oh, so
really
you're telling
needed
me
to do
like
some
yoga is like
mobility.
a real thing? I should do yoga? Yoga's not just like boring.
Wow.
No, I
Yeah.
really wish
That's
that I
wild.
liked yoga. Yeah, it's pretty wild. I think
Yeah.
I also think about it a lot, like when you watch the people in the Tour de France and they are like trying so hard and they are at that absolute limit, like the moment when you're getting dropped on a bike ride, like I am so curious,
Yeah.
like as I was a psychology major, so like what's going on in people's minds is super interesting to me. Like what the threshold of like, I know my pain tolerance is really high, but what's the threshold in which I give up versus they give up versus the guy on the group ride gives up versus my competitors give up? Like at what point are you like, this is too much and I must get dropped right now or I must slow down?
Right.
And I don't think that like
Right.
scientifically there's a way to measure that. It's just everyone's limit. But I would be so curious if there was a way to find out like at what point do we give up? If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, definitely. And no, I think that in all of sport, it's such a huge, if not the dominant factor in when people win or lose or keep going is,
Yeah.
yeah, when do people tap out, right?
Yeah, totally. And I do think another aspect of like, why do you ride? Why do you push? Like that does, it gives you an advantage. It gives you something, you know, to push for. And I think if you say, what do you line up for? What's your mentality? Like if people ask me like, what should I do as my first race? I'm like, have something in your mind that when it gets really, really hard, you can look to that and say, this is why I'm out here. Is it because you sacrificed time with your family to train? Is it because you sacrificed resources to be here? Is it because you, hopefully not, but it's because you lost someone and they would love to be at that race instead of you? Like, whatever it is that you have in yourself that you can say, it's going to get really, really hard and I need to go to something in order to push myself past that.
Yeah. And when you originally set out to become a professional athlete, I think before that, your first race as a triathlete, is it correct that your first race was an Ironman?
So it was gonna be. It was gonna be half. I
Okay.
signed up for the. I got a
Okay.
bike. I had signed up for the Hawaii half Ironman. I immediately broke my collarbone. I hit a tourist in Sausalito. She was okay, but I broke my collarbone again with the high
That
collarbones. Broke my
tracks.
collarbone.
Sounds right.
Like rode home. My dad was like, "Ooh, the adrenaline's about to wear off. Like, you should probably take a shower and like get clothes, like regular clothes on." And I was supposed to fly to New York on the red eye that night to move out of my apartment because I was going to move to business school. And I was like, "Well, we have movers coming." My mom handed me like 2 Advil, and I got on the plane with a shoulder that really hurt. And then I got x-rays the next morning in New York City. And they were like, "Oh, you broke your collarbone." So that was another in kind of wild story. So that was my intro to biking. That was like three weeks into getting a bike. So I couldn't do the Ironman or the half Ironman that I originally signed up for. So I signed up for one that was 2 days before I started business school. And I guess a week before there was the Donner Triathlon, which is in Lake Tahoe, which goes
Okay.
up over Donner Pass. That was like an Olympic distance triathlon, and I won that. And again, you're like, great, I kind of like this sport. Like I just won my first race. That was awesome. Um, and so then with that, I flew to Boulder, did my first half Ironman, and then flew back to Los Angeles and still had like the Sharpie number on my leg and the Ironman bracelet. And so you show up to business school like in your business casual, but you still have like very obvious indicators of like this girl's kind of a weirdo. She likes endurance athletics, and I really was so new into it. But if that's the first impression that people
Yeah.
get, like that's the brand that you kind of have, and with that, um, kind of built it through school. And it's interesting to look at like within the triathlon world. Like I was the kind of nerdy business school student, and then within the business school world, like I was the like endurance girl that was gonna show up to class with her goggle marks on because she just came to the pool, or like she was gonna do a 4-hour bike ride before we all went to the bar that afternoon, things like that. So it was an interesting juxtaposition of like depending, and I think it's again a way to market yourself. It's like depending on what world you're in, like what is your differentiator,
Right.
um, which was kind of initially how that kind of the idea of marketing, like I started to wrap my head around it, of how do you go into this either triathlon or gravel world, how do you differentiate yourself, how do you find a niche that people aren't doing maybe, and fill that in.
I want to come back to that. First, I have a follow-up question about your wreck in Sausalito.
Yes.
Having ridden through there
Terrifying.
hundreds of times myself,
Terrifying.
and I bet many of my listeners have as well, or perhaps have been there as a tourist. I want to know, where exactly did this wreck happen?
Where's
Number
Crash
one, and
Corner?
number two, were you okay? All
What's
right.
no? What's number two? I'll do both.
Okay. Number two is, were you on a tri bike?
Ugh, thank God, no. At the time, I
Okay.
was on a $1,000 felt F4. I was like, this is the nicest bike ever. Oh my gosh, it's so fast. It's carbon, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And now I look back and I just gave it to a friend
Yeah.
who's just getting into cycling. And I'm like, this bike does wonders. It may not look like a lot, but it got me where I am today. I was not on a triathlon bike.
It's
I did
amazing.
my first, half Ironmans on that bike. And I still, to this day, like, it was when you start, like, it was age group starts. So I, as a 27-year-old female, would start behind the 30 to 20, whatever, the older men, the like kind of hardo men, and passing a all kitted out 32-year-old
Nice.
male on an Aero everything bike on your little felt F4 being like, nice job. Like, that was truly my favorite part of triathlon. That was so great. And they would always like kind of grumble as you pass by. You're like, oh yeah, this is good. Crash Corner in Sausalito. So there's that T intersection. I guess if you're going towards the city, there's an intersection where you're kind of most of the way through, but there's restaurants kind of on both sides. The light had turned yellow. I was already in the intersection. And so I was looking to my right to make sure no cars were going to start going if anyone was going to go early. And a little family of Swedish tourists started walking. And I remember I looked forward and I was like, mom, dad, child, and like hit my brakes. I yelled, the mom stopped walking. So like if she had kept moving, I was going to actually make it in between her and her child. I did not. I hit her. It wasn't actually at that high of a speed. She had the most dramatic part. She was holding this glass lemonade. I remember it so vividly, and it like shattered everywhere. And so everyone that's brunching in Sausalito is like, oh my God. And so it caused this like total scene. But we went to the side. I gave her all my information, and I never got a call from the Swedish hospital or anything like that. So she apparently was fine. So I hope she's doing well today. I
Yeah.
think she was just rattled, honestly.
Yeah. I hope so too. Yeah.
It was, but it was, again, it
That
was
would
my
be
intro
scary as a
into
pedestrian.
like, take your time. Average speed on a bike doesn't matter. Like, go slow through Sausalito. I like to joke that like, if you're riding over the Golden Gate Bridge, like there's an inverse correlation between how high your FTP is and how fast you like to go on the bridge. Like, the slower you are, the faster you rip the bridge, and the faster you are, like the more secure you are with just like relaxing on the bridge and getting home safe. So lessons that you learn kind of as you go.
Yeah, I think if some people could teleport, they would teleport to somewhere. They might teleport to Mount Everest or
Mike's
somewhere
bite.
cool. I think
Oh
a lot of
yeah.
yeah, a lot of cyclists would just teleport past that whole section of
A
the ride
thousand
in the Bay Area, and they would
percent.
drop themselves, like they drop themselves into Casio or something. I think, or maybe
A
they'd
thousand
even go up
percent.
north of Point Reyes. I don't know. Yeah, that's amazing. So what was the crucial moment when you decided to leave arm warmers behind and walk away from triathlon?
It was, I mean, it was COVID. It's an interesting kind of serendipitous moment where you say, I had been, I don't know, it was like 3 months after graduation, and I did one, professional triathlon, and I was so last out of the water that you're like, yeah, you can make up a certain amount of time on the bike, but there's only so much time. Like 9 minutes is really hard to make up. Um, so in COVID, I focused and switched to focusing on just cycling. Like, that was always kind of the goal. And I didn't see, because I hadn't done any cycling races, like, even though I got really fast and my power numbers were really good, I talked to a few pro teams and they were like, this is great, but you've never like actually raced. You're a Cat 5, so we can't just like have you on our pro team. And so with that, the focus kind of switched. The off-road like race scene always intrigued me. I like the idea of, get dirty, get dusty. Like, aero isn't everything. It is, I mean, it's becoming more now, but just like kind of the mental toughness side of the longer endurance races. And it's interesting. Yesterday, I did a big training ride from Santa Monica up to Ojai and then back. So it was like an eight hour ride, like 165 miles, 107. And that ride for me in COVID, this ride yesterday was with the same two friends that had invited me to go on this ride in COVID. And that was my longest ride ever. And it kind of sparked this joy in doing really, really kind of wild things. Like if you saw someone yesterday on a Wednesday, I'm gonna go ride my bike for 8 hours. Like I jokingly, I was like, I want to go get lunch in Ojai. And you're like, yeah, people do that. They jump in their car and they go get lunch in Ojai and then they drive back and it takes them probably an equivalent amount of time. But like for me, it sparked this idea of like your body can truly do really crazy things. And yes, an Ironman is absolutely insane. And I went to Kona last year just as a spectator, and I was blown away by like just the caliber and the hardness of it. But I do think the arrow is everything, no drafting, like, by your speed kind of thing for me was not part of it. I like the world of mountain bikes and gravel where it's still a high barrier entry, but maybe it's less all about how nice your bike is and more about like the mental toughness and the grit of it. And so that I'm thankful that COVID kind of gave me a moment to step back and say, you're a really bad swimmer. So maybe if you start on the same line as everybody on the bike instead of 9 minutes behind them, like you might have a chance to actually be good at this sport.
Did you write a business plan for yourself?
I didn't. Maybe I kind of like wrote it in my head, but I didn't write out a formal one. I probably should have, and I might have done this a little bit better if I had. But I think it was interesting. There was a time in 2020 where things were not really, there was still, I don't know, not much hope of coming out of it. It was, September, or you were kind of like and I was ready. I don't know, my mom was looking at me like, okay, like what's the plan? Like, yeah, what is the business plan? You've gotten really fast and Strava QOMs are great, and you've done some crazy rides, but how do you turn this into something that's actually like monetizable? And I ended up like using the business school. I reached out to people on LinkedIn, like, and said, like, I'm either thinking about getting a job or thinking about doing this. Like, do you want to partner with me? I made a PowerPoint deck. I was like, here's who Isabel King is. If you partner with me, like, here's the things that I would do if society doesn't come back to racing. Like, here's the challenges, the FKTs, the multi-day things that I want to do. And I think that was super helpful in like kind of getting the wheels spinning in a way. So I didn't have a formal business plan, but I definitely did lean on the business school aspects of like, okay, I know how to kind of pitch myself or pitch a business. And if I treat myself like a business entity, how do you get people to buy into that as investors, basically?
At that point in time, how big was your social media following?
Like 2,000 people. It was very small. It was, I mean, it's
Okay.
that's still a lot of people, but I do think it's funny now because I forget that I have like a larger following. And it's funny, I had to like ask my sister, I'm like, is it okay if I put like your children on my story? Because it's more like, it's more people than just like my friends and family at this point. And so I share a lot. It's funny, all of my closest friends are kind of like, so we know what you're up to. And you're like, yeah, you have my like day to day and like hilarious, like things that I think is, funny little anecdotes and things like that. But it has been interesting. Like I have kind of purposely tried to grow it. Just from if you can, again, like if you can build a platform that hopefully does some good beyond race results, if you hopefully can use it. I don't like
Sure.
to think of myself as an influencer, but if you can use it as like inspire others or set some precedent for, you can be fast, but you can also be friendly, and maybe be like a little bit more of an approachable pro, then that for me adds value beyond just the race result.
Yeah, definitely. The reason I asked that question is I was listening to the back catalog of other interviews that you've done,
The early
and I've
days.
heard you talk about that. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it actually wasn't that long ago. Like I said, you've done a lot in a very short period of time.
Thanks.
Hats off to you.
Thank you.
And you went out, you became, I'm assuming that within the LA cycling community, that if you're at that point in time, if you were going out and taking a bunch of CRs, QOMs, people within that community likely knew who you were and you became somewhat noteworthy, I would
Yeah.
think, or you had some level of notoriety in the local cycling community.
Mhm.
And then I was thinking about, um, I was curious if you had a business plan. And then I was thinking about, okay, had you truly achieved product market fit, what is the total addressable market for the product that you're offering?
Yeah.
And it sounds like, you had proof of concept with your QOM CRs. You had not yet really, like at that point in time, you hadn't really done any gravel racing though, right?
No, my first gravel race was June 2021. So I did a lot in the pandemic. Like I was super thankful. I did kind of a 3 day. I called it Mountains for Medics. I wanted to try and raise money for the UCLA healthcare workers. So I did a 3 day, 112 miles and 12,000 feet of climbing each day, back to back, to kind of mimic their
Yeah,
12-hour shifts that they were doing. That was helpful for me in kind of saying like, how do you use a bike to build, to make it bigger than yourself. And I was super
sure.
fortunate for that. But again, yeah, like if you say like within the LA cycling community, like I was relatively well known, and then how do you build that beyond that? Is an interesting, challenge.
Yeah, but you did it. But I would say though that the sponsors who backed you at that point or who saw your deck, I'm sure it was a great deck.
I
I'd
don't
actually like to
know.
see it. I don't know if you still have the deck. Yeah. But I mean, it's almost like you were the startup, you created a pitch deck. It's almost like you were a pre-seed company going out and raising around, and some people saw the potential in what you were doing based on the social proof you had from
Yeah,
these different things you've done. It's all quite interesting, and it's working out, which is
yeah,
super cool.
it was fun.
Um, yeah, and so did you? I mean, you've said a couple of times like, "Hey, there's a limited shelf life for people doing this type of thing." At the outset, did you just want to like get to next and see what happened, or did you have this sense of, okay, I'm going to give myself this much runway. If I don't get to point X by time Y, then I'm out. How did you think about it?
Yeah, I think it was 1 year initially. I think graduating from business school with zero income is interesting. From definitely a joke that my career counselor was like, is we love what you're doing, can you not put your salary in our database? Like the data and the numbers and the graduating salaries, like that's a real thing for business school, like those stats matter. And so I'm like in the database as entrepreneur, which now actually like it kind of came into fruition. But at the
Yeah,
time it's that void of like, okay, we're gonna do this for a year. Like I have a runway financially that I've saved from working on Wall Street that I can use, and then we're gonna have to make more money. And so with that, like COVID again, kind of like it gave me time to take a step back and say like, what are you actually good at? What do you want to be doing? Like the bike was always my favorite aspect of the three in triathlon anyway, so leaning into that. And then like, who are you? What kind of brand can you build? So with nothing really happening in COVID, like that year then turned into like, let's see if in 2021, like I got at the end of 2020, I signed with Canyon and was able to kind of like that in a way, like I still think back on it, you're like, that gave me like the confidence to say this might work. Right. So I've had a company buy into me, and then that kind of bought me a little bit of extra time. And funny enough, my contract with Canyon was go get Strava QOMs. Like that's how I'd pitched it. I was like, I will go, you know, I can be paid to go do that. And that was how it was going to be initially. And then I showed up to Unbound, and they were like, wait a second, she actually might be kind of fast in a non-Strava world. And so with that, then was able to build off that and get a few more companies within 2021 to take a chance on me. And then as of last year and then this year, like have built it into a full portfolio of brands that I'm super proud to represent. But again, it was kind of like give yourself a year, and then you kind of like, ooh, okay, I got a nibble. Like, how do you, and I can see how people, like, when you say, oh, I've been working on my startup for X amount of years, you're like, I can see how you go down that rabbit hole of like, you get someone to believe in you, and then it gives you just a little bit more time, and then you get someone else to believe in you, and it buys you like a little bit more time. And with that, I felt like that, where you're like, okay, there is a clock, and it's a funny, I'm not great at rest days. I really think that I have a coach specifically to be like, rest is like, I will ride myself into oblivion, because I think like I otherwise would be sitting at my desk from 9 to 5 if I'm lucky. Like Wall Street hours were like 6 to 7 or 8, like it was, I would be at a desk otherwise. So why shouldn't I be working, riding my bike that time as well? And so it's an interesting, when you have a ticking clock, you feel this like, okay, we got to hustle. We got to do something, like answer your emails, train, like get better, figure out like, how do you push yourself and make yourself worthy of partnerships, which is interesting. Which I will say,
Right.
my
And
coach is not doing a great job keeping me. Well, he's doing a great job, but I looked at my Strava today, and I'm over 1,000,000 feet as of 2 days ago. So I was like, that's not bad. That's like, we made it, halfway through the year.
yes. And I mean, given I've been thinking about this a lot specifically because I've heard you talk about this specific point on a couple of other podcasts. And I think it can be super hard, especially for highly competitive, motivated, super alpha people, um, to particularly within professional sports, because so much of the job, it's rest and recovery and being able to absorb
Yeah,
the training, right? And like
totally.
that's actually, I mean, like that's such a crucial part of the job. Do you struggle with that,
A
with holding
thousand
yourself
percent.
back and just like stopping and taking that Monday and Friday off so you can absorb all that effort and go to the next level?
They're really hard. I'm getting better at it. I definitely am. Um, but a lot of the times it's an interesting, when you, this goes into, I guess, more of the mental side of it, but when you put like a lot of physical exertion into something, and then you slow down, and you have to sit on the couch, and you have to, have that time where you're not doing something physically, like a lot of the, what am I doing with my life, like am I doing enough, like all of that floods in. um yeah, so I'm not good at it. And I think like a lot for me, my dad died when he was 64. Like, he was the fittest, healthiest, everything. And like, he said, just like a saber-toothed tiger got to his brain. Well, yeah, that was his way of saying like, uh, he had brain cancer. And I'm 32 right now, so like, if you think about that, if I'm halfway done, like, am I doing it right? Or even like, if I'm done, I get hit by a car tomorrow, like, will I have done enough to be remembered, or have I made a difference in this world? And I think like, those are really scary thoughts to think about, and it's not helpful when like, you're like, I must sit here on this couch and like purposefully slow down in order to be able to do your job. Um, so yeah, rest days are rough. But I think it's all, again, like all good things. Because it's really easy to get into a routine and just be like, ride your bike, post your selfie on social media, race your race, like blah blah blah, like get into that. And so I think like trying to keep the bigger picture of like, what are you doing beyond your own self? What are you doing to make this world a better place, even if it's in a tiny community of cyclists, of stretchy spandex wearing people? Like, how do you make it a better place?
Yeah, I'm sorry for your loss. And I think, I mean, that's heavy, of course. And it sounds like it really circumscribes your notion of what is enough, like what is enough to have done today
Yeah.
in this moment with your
Yeah.
training, with whatever it is that you're doing. And as you, and maybe it's not even possible to do this because it sounds like, you know, you're trying to get the very most out of every day, which is, you know, that's a very worthy pursuit and something we should all try to do. When you think about the long run and whether it's what you continue to do as a professional cyclist or beyond that,
Yeah.
like what else is out there that you're wanting to achieve in your life or that you'd like to try?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think, yeah, I think the biggest question mark now is what do you if I talk about like the shelf life of competing at the top of the sport, like what do you do after you're not doing that? Um, Originally, my plan was to go into fintech. I work for a company in San Francisco called Varo, which is a mobile banking company, kind of reshaping the world of banking, making it more accessible and more enjoyable for everybody. And I liked that idea. I loved the finance and the number side of Wall Street. I didn't love the traditional finance start. So I think like the fintech world is really interesting to me. Like finances and money and the way that our world works is not going to go away. And how do you help educate and make people like kind of feel better and I don't know, help them, do their finances better. I liked that idea, but again, you're like, is that impact, is the work that I do that at a startup going to be more impactful than I could, if I just focus on a smaller demographic of people that ride bikes? And do you stay in the bike world and do you say, okay, like I've noticed certain things in the bike industry that feel broken to me from a business side of it? Like, do you say, I want to fix the business side? I'm going to work for one of the partners that I have or one of the companies that are in this bike world and try and make that a better product for then the people? Or do you go off the deep end and you just say like, I don't know, like it's a hard, because I get paralyzed by optionality almost, in that my life so far, it would be hard to predict the path that I've gone through, like to go like grow up as a soccer player, like highly motivated, highly driven, and then going to Columbia in New York City, like graduate as a psychology major and go work on the trading floor, and then move back to the West Coast. It's just like it's kind of a wild ping pong ball of a career path so far. So when people say what's next, I am like, I don't know. But also with that, it's kind of the beauty of like, my mom always told us when we were growing up, like, you're never gonna regret having options. And so with that, like, if you try your best at everything that you are doing, the optionality, like, you're never gonna be mad about having a potential to go work either X place or Y place or do different things. So with that, like, the bike career was not ever the plan. And so with that, try and live in that moment. And then when the time comes, you got to say like, okay, what's next in this abyss of, your, my own, how do I change the world mentality? And am I doing enough? Try and figure out like what that would be, which is, I think, a lot of pressure, but hopefully I can figure it out.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about your path as like a ping pong ball kind of experience. Honestly, I've done nearly 100 episodes of this podcast. When I was a journalist, I'm sure I interviewed more than 1,000 people and some of the world's highest achievers. And just in my day-to-day life and, my life and business world as an executive and whatever, I feel like narrative and linearity and experience are just things that people impose like over time as
Yeah.
the picture starts to gel. I don't think it actually makes a lot of sense to
Like, if
anybody as
anyone
it's
actually
happening.
has like
Maybe
done, yeah,
right.
maybe there are people maybe that are like, in 10 years I will actually do this. Like, if I had laid this out and if you had told me as a 22-year-old graduating from college, like, this is your path, I'd been like, no way, awesome, but no way. And so I think with that, like, it's nice to feel like you have some control in your life where you're, there is definitely a path where you could say like you work at this firm and you get promoted and this is a very set path, and that's awesome. But I also think I've kind of learned, another kind of saying that we had in our family growing up was keep your knees bent, which came from skiing moguls. You keep your knees bent. Like if you visibility is not great, you keep your knees bent. You can kind of absorb and take on kind of whatever bumps in the road that come your way. And so with that, unfortunately, we've really had to keep our knees bent in the last 2 years and navigating, or I guess 4 years now, navigating everything with my dad. But somehow, stay on your feet, keep moving forward, and see where you can go with it.
Yeah, I like that. That's a great saying, because ultimately it really does seem, I do believe in free will generally. And I also think control generally is totally an illusion. I think we have, you can control it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like if you think
So
about like how do
even
you
things that seem linear are not necessarily linear.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like again, if you go to a race, you're like, "Oh, I control my outcome today." Also kind of what's fun, people say like gravel racing, like a lot of it comes down to luck, and you're like, "Yeah." Like there's a certain amount of skill and preparation and everything that you can do, and then something's going to be thrown your way, and if you don't keep your knees bent, you're going to be in a ditch, or you're going to be, walking and not finish, or get hurt, like there's a lot of different things that are going to be thrown your way. And that's an interesting, like, I think you can extrapolate it out to life in general and say like, life's going to be a lot like a gravel race where it's going to be really hard at times. And how do you, take the things that are thrown at you and go from there and make it to, I don't know, whatever the proverbial finish line would be.
In general, what do you consider to be risky?
Oh gosh. So I've always been a daredevil. Like I don't remember this, but apparently my first swimming lesson ever, I convinced the swim instructor I needed to jump off the diving board, even though I didn't know how to swim to the side. And I was like, you just wait down there for me. Like I want to jump off this diving board. And then my mom was like, great, this is terrifying. um, and so with that, I definitely think like the risk tolerance is higher. I think, if you have a family, if you have others that are dependent on you, I think like I don't have children of my own yet, but I consider my sisters and my mom like very big parts of that. So everything that I do, you want to make sure that like not only are you not putting them in a position where, you know, they would be, I don't know, I'd be either hurting myself or doing something that's detrimental to our family. And then obviously like financial risk and things like that is definitely, I was fortunate enough to be in a position where I wasn't like, strapped financially, coming out of business school. And so I was able to take a risk and say, it's okay that I don't have an income for a year. So with that, like, I wouldn't say that I'm risk averse. I think probably higher risk tolerance than most, especially when it comes to like doing, crazy athletic things. But I do like to keep it safe. I do think in everyday life, as we talk about, like there's a lot of things that you can't control. I like to try and minimize the potential of risk. So descending fast is awesome. I will be at the back of our group in every training ride on a Saturday, just happily taking up the caboose, because in a race, I will rip it. I will absolutely rip it. And there will be a chance that I overcook a corner or something like that. But for me, like the Strava glory of a descent right now is something that I don't need to do. So I definitely have like the day to day of like minimize, like if it's a blind corner, I'm not going to go over the other side of the road. Or if it's there's only a certain amount of like, I don't know, if that stop sign is really going to ruin my day like that, I probably should reevaluate, why I feel that I'm so late to something. So things like that, again, like what would, I don't know, try and be a representation of what you want others to be, I guess. So take risks where it matters and then
Totally.
try and minimize the other ones.